I'm joined now by Karabo Mokgonyana, a renewable energy campaigns lead at Power Shift Africa. Very good afternoon to you, Karabo. Lots coming out of Baku, of course. And also, you just saw that protest that was taking place, and it was quite interesting to hear one of those protesters saying, we don't need solutions from the global north.
That's correct. Good afternoon, Amasa, and good afternoon to your viewers. It's quite intense here in Baku because the stakes are high. You know, finance is at the heart of the conversations that are happening here at COP29. And finance is a big component of climate action, energy transitions. It has to be decided. And unfortunately, from my perspective in terms of what has been happening, unfortunately, there's a deadlock in a lot of the decisions that I'm making. So decisions are not being made and compromises are not being made specifically from the global north. So decisions haven't been made around just transitions, around adaptation, around mitigation, and even just this quantum that we're looking for. Because at the heart of this negotiations is we want to walk away with a new quantified collective goal that puts a number on what exactly it is that we want. And so far, developing countries have put 1.3 trillion on the table, but it's serving to be quite a challenge in terms of developing countries coming to the table.
So is that where the deadlock is, Karabo, to agree on the figure that these developed countries will be able to fund the developing countries? So they've agreed that there must be funding, but it's just the figure. So if the developing countries are saying it should be $1.3 trillion, what are the developed countries saying?
What we're seeing is the conversation around the quantum is kind of being put in the back burner. Everything else is being discussed around how it is that we're going to deal with the climate crisis, how it is that we're going to deal with energy transitions. We are barely seeing a direct conversation on the actual number and the quantum. But there's also conversations from the developing or developed nations whereby there's almost like an expectation that developing countries should also come to the table. And I think this speaks heavily to the geopolitical issues or the geopolitics that are happening right now. If you look around the world, there's a lot of movement towards nationalist countries are focusing on themselves quite a lot. We're seeing a lot of left-wing movements. It's no longer this is a climate crisis and we're collectively dealing with this issue and we need to come to the table to address it. Everybody's looking out for themselves, which is kind of becoming a problem because, climate change and energy transitions are not a developing country or global south issue. This is a global issue. And those that have the resources to finance this should come to the table. And unfortunately, we are not seeing that. We are seeing the geopolitics at play here.
And speaking of those geopolitics, Karabo, they have also historically been there where, developing nations and continents like Africa are seemingly put on the back burner, seen as if they're coming in with a bigging bowl, for instance. But when we're looking at, emissions as well into the environment, the continent of Africa, when you compare it to some of these developed nations, is basically a drop in the ocean. So when there is this focus to then say these developing nations should also come to the table, particularly the finance table, is there a balance in that kind of rhetoric? Because it does seem a little bit unfair if you are contributing the least and expected also to contribute significantly financially.
Yeah, and that rhetoric is the reason, or is the one that a lot of the developing countries are using to say that we are the least emitters, so therefore we should contribute the least. But also just from a resource perspective, developed countries do have the resources to contribute much more to the table in dealing with this, climate crisis. So we're talking two parts of, yes, developing countries are emitting less, and therefore should bear less of a burden from a financial perspective, but also developing countries don't have the kind of resources that developed countries actually do have. So it's a fairness conversation, but even that is not necessarily pushing, the conversations in that direction. It's really a, left-wing nationalist approach to this conversation. And we hope that, what has happened at G20 will push a bit of the conversations aside and provide political will for developed countries to come to the table and get to a point whereby a quantum is decided on, and we really start viewing climate change as a global issue and not a developing or global south issue.
And this move, you know, the language of more moving from fossil fuels to greener energy as well, do we find that, you know, this onus has also been put more on these emerging countries as opposed to the ones who are the biggest emitters as well, that they should also be focusing on greener and renewable energy more than they do on fossil fuels?
Absolutely. And that's where the issue is. There's a power dynamics here at play. You know, when it comes to just transitions or phasing out fossil fuels, everybody's looking at the global south to be that starting point. But we've seen in some of, for example, just the example on closing, you know, coal power plants. Global South and, for example, South Africa has been directed to close down some of those coal power plants. But then you start seeing the reverse, whereby, for example, Germany will open their power plants. So the conversation is quite two-sided in that there is a call for us to phase out fossil fuels, and then there's a call for that without financing being put on the table. So even if you're asking developing countries to phase out fossil fuels, they need financing to transition into renewable energy or greener energy. So both sides cannot coexist. You need to provide the financing at the table, or developing countries will continue relying on fossil fuels because energy access is important.
That is true indeed. Karabo, thank you so much for bringing us up to speed with everything happening there in Baku. That was Karabo Mokgonyana, who is a renewable energy campaigns lead at Power Shift Africa.